Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Eternalism Weighs In. My name is David, and the title of this podcast is Unmasking Postmormonism and the Faith Crisis Movement. This is episode 9. In the last episode, I mentioned that we would be finishing up this current series, which went under the title of Unmasking Postmormonism and the Faith Crisis Movement, and that I would be shifting my attention to a second series and under the new heading of Unmasking Postmodernism and the Woke Crisis Movement. So with that transition in mind, this episode 9 will be my final episode in this current series. However, because of questions, clarifications, and other areas of interest, I will reserve the right to add additional episodes as I feel the need to do so. So don't be surprised to find an episode 10 or 11 added to this current series at some future date. For now, however, this episode 9 will be my attempt to address and wrap up a few loose ends pertaining to millennials and this faith crisis movement before moving on to the next series. As a refresher, let's return to That Mormon Boy's YouTube, or rather to a second and third YouTube video that Nathan Rio came out with a few months after his first video on 3 Nails in the Coffin, where he presented the problem-solution scenario as to why millennials are leaving the church and as to what we as a church can do to keep them from leaving. You'll recall the problem was threefold and fell under the headings of church history, church policies, and church discipline. And the solution was threefold as well, demanding of the church in general and of church leaders in particular to come clean, wake up, and get real. And if you'll recall, that if the church would do so, he all but guaranteed that millennials would not leave the church in droves as they currently are, but would stick with the church regardless of its perceived problems. Now, to put us back into the framework and mindset of these millennials in this post-Mormon induced faith crisis, let's listen once more to what that Mormon boy has to say in his second video as he talks about the need to do something within the church about the pain and suffering that this Mormon faith crisis has caused him and others, and which in his mind is entirely unnecessary. So let's hear what he has to say in this new video.
You know, I just wish that somehow we could do something to eliminate or alleviate some of the suffering, because there is unnecessary suffering happen. There's an exorbitant amount of suffering happening with the Mormons in faith crisis. We should all, both outside the church and inside the church, help Mormons who are going through this, because the church, let's face it, church leaders really aren't doing very much to help them, because they're caught between condemning them and understanding them, and they can't really move there's not a lot of wiggle room. So church leaders end up just choosing a course of inaction, essentially inaction. And it's almost like, it's really unfortunate that that's the case, but people like me, we can't just walk away from the church knowing that there's so much suffering for innocent people that are honest and that are just blindsided. It's tough. It's really tough.
What that Mormon boy has not taken into account in these various YouTube videos of his, and what we tried to point out at the end of the last episode, is that this faith crisis, which in his mind is causing so much pain and suffering within the church, is taking place within a far more pervasive, influential, and wider cultural context. And, truth be told, that it is this wider cultural context that is giving impetus to the great majority of this underlying pain and suffering experienced by church members within this woke culture. In other words, take away the woke culture that permeates the younger generations of our day, and how much pain and suffering associated with the church's social policies goes away with it. It is questions such as this that I would like to address in this final episode. But first, to avoid confusion and misunderstanding, let me make two important clarifications pertaining to the use of the term millennials and postmillennials and my diagnosis and prognosis of these younger generations. First off, whenever I speak of millennials and postmillennials, I am speaking in generational terms, and I am not calling out specific individuals who may or may not conform to these generational beliefs, norms, and attitudes that do in fact pervade the great majority of these younger generations. And so my concern with millennials and postmillennials is always a generational concern and is never intended as an attack on any specific individual or individuals within that generational demographic. For example, one can refer to a herd mentality among wild horses without singling out any one mare or stallion within that herd that may in fact be struggling to break free and gallop off in an entirely different direction with its own idea of how best to live and fulfill its innate propensities as a wild horse in an open range. Secondly, and shifting the analogy from wild horses to the medical field, I would like to point out that a doctor's diagnosis and prognosis is not intended as an attack on the patient, but rather is intended as a timely and professional opinion on the individual's current state of health and future likely developments if treatments or changes in behavior are not taken seriously. Likewise, these current episodes are not intended as an attack on millennials and postmillennials, but as a general diagnosis and prognosis of this woke culture and the precarious state of all those individuals who are caught up into this woke vortex that I spoke of in the last episode. And so I wanted to make it clear that this diagnosis and prognosis is intended to be of a generational and cultural nature and not of an individual or personal nature, and is only applicable to the individual to the degree that he or she allows themselves to become a part of this captured operation wherein they are caught up into this woke vortex that does not and cannot end well for the world, nor for the future of the church. Which alarming diagnosis and prognosis leads us to the next set of questions. At the end of the last episode, we asked and only partially answered a two-part question, which went as follows. Who are these millennials, and should we as a church be worried? If you'll recall, I allowed you to answer that question for yourself. But it should be clear by now that in my judgment, we should be worried, and worried a great deal. You can take that as just being my opinion, or you can take it more seriously and pay attention to the observations, arguments, and judgments being made in these episodes. No, this doesn't mean that I am freaking out every time I encounter a millennial or postmillennial within or without the church. But it does mean that I take their collective influence, social media presence, and immediate impact on the woke culture that we live within very seriously, and with a sense of societal alarm that needs first to be acknowledged if it is to be addressed in any timely or profitable fashion. One individual who has taken notice within the church of these generational changes over time is the author and scholar Jana Reese. So let's take a moment to take a look at her work. As a professional scholar and LDS author, Jana Reese has been tracking, through research and surveys, the impact that millennials are having on the church, and who in 2019 published her findings in a book titled The Next Mormons, with the subtitle of How Millennials Are Changing the LDS Church. This book, which is full of surveys and hundreds of questions presented to baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials in the church, was an attempt on her part to zero in on changing generational trends among the Latter-day Saints. What she discovered was a steady and often alarming downturn or decline among the various generations of the church pertaining to Latter-day Saint Orthodox beliefs, practices, and social issues. As a sample, I will just refer to 3 out of the hundreds of questions surveyed. These 3 questions happen to be foundational truth claims, so it will give us a good sense or feel for the direction the church is heading in as it pertains to our core beliefs. The first survey question I reference refers to a member's certitude in regard to Joseph Smith as a prophet of God. In other words, what percentage of members in this or that generational demographic could state that they know this to be a gospel truth? Among the baby boomers, 67% stated that they do not simply believe, but that they know Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. Among the Gen Xers, the percent dropped to 54%, and among the millennials, it dropped even further to 51%. The second question pertained to the historical authenticity of the Book of Mormon. Among the baby boomers, 62% responded that they do not merely believe, but know the Book of Mormon to be a literal historical account. The Gen Xers dropped to 53%, and the millennials dropped even further to 50%, meaning that only half of this younger generation now believes that characters within the Book of Mormon, such as Nephi, King Benjamin, Alma, and Moroni, were real historical characters. Finally, the third question pertained to the members' certitude as to the LDS Church being the one and only truth faith leading to exaltation. 56% of baby boomers responded that they know with certitude that the LDS Church was and is the only true faith leading to exaltation, while only 49% of the Gen Xers responded with such certitude, and our millennials dropped another percentage point to 48%. One of the interesting findings in these surveys was that Gen Xers were far more in line with the millennials than with the baby boomers, and in fact took the largest initial drop in percentages, and being the first to distance themselves from the orthodox views of the baby boomers, with the millennials merely adding a few more percentages downward, telling us that it was not the millennials but the Gen Xers who first began distancing themselves from the orthodox views, practices, and beliefs of the church. This downward trend away from the orthodox views, practices, and beliefs of the church goes a long ways toward explaining why there has been a generational decline in any profound interest in the plan of salvation, with its 3 estates and 3 degrees of glory, that once inspired and captivated the attention of the baby boomers to the extent that it did in the 1964 World's Fair in New York, which highlighted the film Man's Search for Happiness. Again, in today's woke culture, millennials and postmillennials are far more cause-oriented than gospel-oriented, and are no more worried about their eternal souls than they are about what they will have for breakfast tomorrow, since the food on the table and salvation in the afterlife will somehow take care of itself. What haunts these younger generations in the church is not, am I good enough to get into heaven, but am I woke enough? And, of course, when it comes to social justice and this woke religion of diversity, equity, and inclusiveness, one can never be woke enough. And it is this inherent inadequacy that causes the woke crisis that underlies and leads to the faith crisis that is so much talked about these days, as one comes to realize that it is also impossible for the church to ever be woke enough. In any event, for millennials and postmillennials, man's search for happiness is not so much to be found in the hereafter or in the plan of salvation, as it is to be found in the here and now and in rallying around the socially marginalized and disfranchised, and doing all one can to eliminate or at least alleviate the endless suffering in the world. And so these younger generations have little interest and little time to spare for worrying about happiness in the next life, since all foundational truth claims, such as a hereafter, are, for millennials and postmillennials, off the table. This generational downward trend should alarm us all, particularly since we haven't seen as yet the downward trends of the postmillennials. So yes, we should all be worried, and worried a great deal with the direction the younger generations are heading in. For example, Jana Reese's research showed that 50% of today's millennials find themselves incapable of believing in the foundational truth claims of the church with any degree of certitude, and that these next Mormons were shifting away from a faith-centered church of core beliefs, gospel ordinances, and dogmas to a more community-centered church where spirituality is seen in cosmic terms of universal love and providing community service. Interestingly enough, that Mormon boy falls right in line with these latest findings. Listen to what he has to say about his personal views as to the authenticity of the Book of Mormon, the prophetic calling of Joseph Smith, and to the church in general.
I just consider myself a nuanced Mormon because I didn't really literally take the Book of Mormon to be true, to be historical anymore, or the Book of Abraham. I didn't literally take Joseph Smith to be a prophet, at least in the way that the church represented or presented him. I did not literally believe in the truth claims of Mormonism anymore. But I was like, I can see the good in the church. I still believe in God, or at least I want to believe in God. There's certainly spirituality happening, and I can help people. I kind of felt like a fraud because here I am serving in the church, but I don't literally even believe its truth claims.
This faith crisis and this rejection of the foundational truth claims of the church leads us to another interesting question in our day, and that is this: why can't people who leave the church just move on and leave the church alone? In the past, the majority of those who did leave the church did leave it alone, but not today. So what's so different about post-Mormonism and this faith crisis movement that won't allow them to simply walk away and move on with their lives? That Mormon boy addresses this question this way. He says, and I quote, "People like me, we can't just walk away from the church knowing that there is so much suffering. I certainly can't just walk away from Mormonism and leave it alone. That's irresponsible. People like me, we need to find a way to help and alleviate the suffering somehow." Unquote. Let's hear what he has to say, and then I will explain what I think is really going on here.
So I can't just unknow the pain of a Mormon faith crisis. I can't just forget about it or move past it or pretend that it didn't happen. And the reason is knowing that other people are going through a Mormon faith crisis. It's too much. I can't stand by and not do anything about it. And so I just feel the need. People say, you leave the church, but you don't leave it alone. No, that's so stupid. It's so juvenile to say that. The truth is, anybody who experiences tragedy, whether you're Martin Luther King, Gandhi, whatever, if you are a person with a heart and a conscience, you experience something grave and horrible, and then you immediately think, oh, other people are going through this, and not just a few. People like me, we can't just walk away from the church knowing that there's so much suffering for innocent people that are honest and that are just blindsided. It's tough. It's really tough. I certainly can't just walk away from Mormonism and leave it alone. That's irresponsible. That's ridiculous. That's like Gandhi saying, yep, the British are here and they're abusing us and they're taking our country's resources and it's an empire, but I'm just going to walk away because I just reject that. I'm just going to walk away and move to a different country. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. People like me, we need to find a way to help alleviate the suffering somehow. All right. See you later.
People who left the church in the past had a heart and a conscience, as well as people who leave the church today. So let me see if I can explain to you what I believe is really going on here. Church members in the past who experienced a faith crisis and left the church were far more gospel-oriented than cause-oriented. And while they had a heart and a conscience too, it is a faith-driven and not a cause-driven woke conscience, as it is today. The millennials and postmillennials of our day, however, are far more cause-oriented than gospel-oriented, and so we see that it is the faith crisis element of this equation that causes them to leave the church, while it is the woke crisis element that prevents them from leaving it alone. Unfortunately for the church, these younger generations who have left the church or are in the process of leaving have taken up changing or reforming the church as their woke cause, and this answers the question as to why they are not going away anytime soon, any more than are those social justice warriors who have devoutly chained themselves to other like-minded woke causes, such as environmentalism, animal rights, Black Lives Matter, or same-sex marriages. So we have two things going on here at once. We have a faith crisis, which accounts for millennials and postmillennials leaving the church, and we have a woke crisis, which accounts for their not leaving the church alone. I think you will have noticed that with the release of each new YouTube video, we are able to peel back the onion more and more on what is going on in the life and head of that Mormon boy. Well, now, Jonathan Streeter has released a colossal 2.5-hour long interview with Nathan Rio, wherein he opens up even more about his current feelings and attitude towards the church, and drops the bombshell that he is done with Mormonism. In any event, let's let him break this surprising and shocking news to you in his own words.
I don't know if I consider myself a Mormon anymore. I think that I'm done. I think I'm pretty much done with attempting any type of belief.
And so, while that Mormon boy may leave the church, there is no way, given his millennial mentality and woke temperament, that he is going to both walk away and leave the church alone. Not unless, of course, he joins some other woke cause. This, by the way, is the type of stability that you have when you set foundational truth claims aside and try to establish a relationship or membership within a church or religion based solely on cause-oriented and community-centered values. And since all objective truth claims are off the table for millennials, they are simply left with subjective feelings, relative values, and political correctness to guide their actions. Interestingly enough, this faith crisis and woke crisis experience reveals itself in these surveys as well, as is evident in this list of the top 4 reasons as to why members of all generations are leaving the church. In any event, here's her list. 1. I could no longer reconcile my personal values and priorities with those of the church. 2. I stopped believing there was one true church. 3. I did not trust the church leadership to tell the truth surrounding controversial or historical issues. 4. I felt judged or misunderstood. It is also interesting to note that when it comes to former Mormon men and women, the top answer that they gave as to what would have helped them stay in the church is the following. For men, the top answer was, if I had more enjoyable experiences attending church. And for women, the top answer was, if ward members had been more loving and less judgmental. As to this feeling of being judged or misunderstood, Jana Reese indicates that for millennials in general, this is a huge issue. She writes, and I quote, "This is a generation that does not want to be judged harshly themselves, and seems careful about not judging others in turn." Unquote. This unspoken agreement among millennials that I won't judge you if you won't judge me has become a large part of this woke cancel culture, where being non-judgmental has become a religious tenet of their woke religion and their woke faith. In fact, to be loving means to be non-judgmental, while to be judgmental to any degree whatsoever is fast becoming a hate crime. Another interesting observation about millennials is this messianic or savior-like image that they have of themselves, and which emboldens them to march in mass, behind a banner in protest of climate justice, as shown here, proclaiming in bold letters that we are the ones we've been waiting for, and which conceals this unspoken message to the older generations that you're the problem, we're the solution. And so, in moving forward, it would be wise to remember the following 2 points about these younger generations. First, millennials look to themselves as the long-awaited guardians of social justice, that is, of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Secondly, millennials see themselves as inherently in the right on all social justice issues, and so they make demands, not requests, of the church. Come clean, wake up, and get real. It's loud, it's clear, and it's non-negotiable. But even though this is what they say they want, it leaves us wondering what it is that they really want. After all, it should be obvious to anyone paying attention that something else is going on here. Something far more radical, pervasive, and life-altering than a mere wake-up call. To address this issue of what millennials and post-Mormons are really after, I have created a chart that I would like to walk you through column by column. At the end, I'll be able to summarize what they are really after in just 3 words. But it is the explanation of the chart that gives understanding and power to those 3 words and serves as a general diagnosis and prognosis of what is going on in the world around us, both within and without the church. To begin with, we have a problem and solution column, as explained before, with the perceived problem working under the heading of 3 nails in the coffin, that is, church history, church policies, and church discipline. Next to the perceived problem column, we have the proposed solution column, working under the heading of 3 demands on the church, that is, come clean, wake up, and get real. This much you have already learned, and represents, for the most part, what these millennials and post-Mormons say they want. But as we shall soon discover, what they say they want and what they really want are not the same thing. In fact, what they really want is so blatant and obvious an outrage to common sense that it must, for them, remain unspoken and undisclosed for now. Because the moment that what they really want is openly spoken, disclosed, or acknowledged, it would instantly expose the entire hidden agenda for what it really is. That is, the end of the church as we know it. To expose this hidden agenda, we must think in terms of 3 columns instead of 2. That is, we need to add to the perceived problem and proposed solution columns a 3rd planned outcome column, working under the heading of 3 intended, and I might add unspoken, outcomes. So let me walk you through each of these 3 intended outcomes, one intended and unspoken outcome at a time, beginning with the first. Now, when it comes to church history, what they say they want is for the church to come clean on its history and foundational truth claims. But what they really want, but do not dare say, is for the church to not just come clean, but to submit itself to a walk of shame, to publicly denounce itself, its past history and teachings, before all the world. That is what they are really after, although they don't dare say it. Next, we have church policies, and what they say they want is for the church to wake up to the problematic social issues, policies, and positions that the church has taken in the past on race, sex, gender, and same-sex marriage. But what they really want, but do not dare say, is for the church to wake up and become woke. And not to just become woke, but to come to the forefront, lead the way, and champion woke causes. That is what they are really after, although they don't dare say it. Lastly, we have church discipline, and what they say they want is for the church to get real and stop playing the blame game with all the personal attacks and threats of excommunication. But what they really want, but do not dare say, is for the church leaders to resign, and not to just resign, but put us in charge. That is what they are really after, although they don't dare say it. You see then the impossible and ludicrous position that these millennials and post-Mormons have placed the church and its leaders in for what they say they want the church to do, to come clean, wake up, and get real, is not what they really want the church to do. That is, what they really want is for the church to submit itself to a walk of shame, to champion woke causes, and ultimately for the leadership to resign and put the millennials and post-Mormons in charge. After all, I cannot tell you how many times I have listened to the guests on Mormon Stories podcast and other like-minded podcasts who have cried out in frustration that if I could be put in charge of the church for just 1 week or even just 1 day, just imagine the changes I could make. Just imagine the good I could do. And yet, without being put in charge, they remain helpless, frustrated, and discontented. Now there is still more to be said, because there is another way of looking at this problem, solution, and outcome columns, and that is from the cancel culture and woke culture perspective. For the whole purpose of the cancel culture is to clear the ground and make way for the woke culture by purging the church of its past history, policies, and leadership, and preparing the ground for a new history, new policies, and new leadership, and which, when taken all together, means clearing the ground for a new church. This, of course, is where the woke culture comes in. For truth be told, what they really want is a woke history, woke policies, woke leadership, all culminating in a woke church. And this is why I mentioned that if things don't turn around, we baby boomers had better start preparing ourselves for a woke Jesus, a woke gospel, and a woke plan of salvation, because that is the direction the next Mormons are driving us in. Now I promised that at the end of this explanation that I would be able to summarize what these millennials and post-Mormons are really after in just 3 words. So what are these 3 words? What are these millennials and post-Mormons really after? Here then is their hidden, unspoken, and undisclosed agenda in just 3 words: submission, compliance, and control. It's a 2-part plan. First, the purge, that's the cancel culture, and then the surge, that's the woke culture. Taken together, it is what they call an insurgency, and which I refer to as being caught up into the woke vortex. Let's end this episode then by referring to this question one last time. That is, who are these millennials, and should we as a church be worried? Hopefully you are beginning to see that there is a great deal more to be worried about than post-Mormonism and this faith crisis movement, and especially if you yourself are a millennial or post-millennial who has already been caught up into this woke vortex of postmodernism, progressive liberalism, and cultural Marxism, and which expresses itself in your life as an ongoing woke crisis, wherein one can never be woke enough. This ends this episode and this series on unmasking post-Mormonism and the faith crisis movement, and points us directly toward the next series of episodes, which I have titled Unmasking Postmodernism and the Woke Crisis Movement. Remember, it is our contention that one cannot truly understand the disquieting nature of a post-Mormon-induced faith crisis without also understanding the underlying power and impetus of this postmodern-induced woke crisis. In any event, I hope you enjoyed this current series, and I look forward to your feedback in the next series as well.